wanted to turn to the remainder of this IR reform you're seeking to get through the Senate. I understand you met business groups on Friday in relation to this. How did that go, and will this go to the Senate this week?
Look, it was a really good meeting with business, and I'm glad they've come back to the table. You remember there was an open letter last year where the conversation was, we only want to have our arguments in public now, and to have the business groups back around the table saying, okay, let's tease out some ideas, work through what might be practical, was really constructive. We haven't made fresh commitments as a result of the meeting, but there are things that we're looking into and getting some departmental advice on. So it was a really constructive meeting. I'm glad business is back at the table. There are constructive ways, and it doesn't mean that they'll end up, preferring the legislation to go through, but it does mean we could avoid some adverse consequences that they might be pointing to. So I won't go through, point by point within the meeting, only to say I'm really glad they're back at the table. It was a constructive meeting, and these conversations are in the best interests of their members and the best interests of landing the best legislation.
All right.
In terms, you asked as well, when it'll go to the Parliament. It's listed for debate in the Senate on Wednesday, so there'll definitely be debate on it this week. In terms of, will it go through? Things go through when there's a majority. At the moment, we're still talking to the crossbench. I think it's a fair bet we're not going to get the opposition's votes on anything that involves people's wages going up. So it's the crossbench conversation that matters. That's still happening. It's constructive, but we're not there yet.
All right, one reported contentious part of this reform you're seeking to put in place that the Greens first suggested is this so-called right to disconnect, an allowance for people if their bosses want to contact them out of work hours. How would this work, and why are you examining it?
Okay, there's been a couple of parliamentary reports that have come out in favour of this, and a lot of work really that's been done by Senator Barbara Pocock on this. I'm interested in the concept, really interested in it, because there are some workplaces, and the employers would acknowledge this as well, there are some workplaces where effectively people are working a whole lot of hours unpaid because they're expected to be permanently on call. Like, you'd remember when we were growing up, you'd go to someone's barbecue and someone would hold the beeper because they were on call that weekend and they were paid an allowance to be on call. Now we've all got our own beeper effectively with our mobile phones, and people are being expected to be constantly on call without being paid for it. So that's the concept. But there's also lots of reasonable contact that an employer might want to make that we've got to make sure we don't create a problem with. So it's completely reasonable for an employer, if they've got a shift that hasn't been filled, to do a ring around to see if someone can do a shift. It's completely reasonable, if you've got a work email, for the employer to be sending emails at any time of day, so long as there's not an expectation that you're doing all the work in unpaid time. So those sorts of principles need to be worked through. And the other thing is, for something that is new, you want to make sure you're not suddenly putting a pressure on business thinking, am I going to be fined? Is something going to go wrong for me, in situations where people are just being reasonable. So there's a lot of scaffolding you need to put around it. I do think there's a real problem for some workers. I'm interested in trying to fix it for them. We're also very much aware there are reasonable grounds for an employer to want to contact their workers outside of hours, and we have to make sure that's protected as well.
Indeed. A place like WA, where they have to deal with the eastern states, they're in a different time zone, for example. This seems quite difficult in a number of ways. How much might an allowance be if it's introduced, and would it be mandatory for certain sectors or all sectors? How would it work?
Oh, look, the sort of concept would be, one of the concepts being talked about, so none of this has landed yet, and the business groups are part of the consultation with this as well. One of the concepts that's being talked about is effectively there's no fines in the jurisdiction, but if it's got completely out of hand of a worker, being expected to do unpaid work, they'd be able to go to the Commission, get a stop order, and then if the stop order was breached, at that point the employer would have been completely on notice. If the stop order was breached, only then would there be a situation of fines. So that's the sort of concept that's being talked about. It's a pretty light touch, but it also establishes a principle that just says, and it shouldn't be a controversial principle, which is, in Australia, You're meant to be paid when you're working.
Okay, so
And that's
Minister,
really all this is about.
it's fines, not an allowance that's being examined. It's penalties. Or is putting in place an allowance for this sort of thing also potentially part of the legislation?
There's already allowances for this sort of thing. My staff, for example, have an allowance for in lieu of unpaid overtime. There's just an allowance that they get acknowledging that these calls can happen out of hours sometimes. There's lots of workplaces where those sorts of allowances are already paid, and that's already dealt with. The question is, when someone is only paid, be it 9 to 5 or 9 to 3 for a part-time or whatever their hours might be, and that's all they're being paid, is it reasonable for them also to be expected to be regularly working outside of those hours without pay? And if it's not reasonable, then what on earth can they easily do about it to be able to get it to stop?
All right. On casuals, business groups have said this to your changes in what they've circulated to MPs. They said the government's definition of casuals is incredibly complex. Business and workers don't understand it. Even the government's own department haven't been able to explain it. No case has been made to change the existing definition in the Act. The current rate of casual employment has remained largely unchanged for decades. The bill will result in fewer casual jobs and less flexibility. What do you say to that?
Okay, first thing, all this law does is take the definition of casual back to what it was a couple of years ago. So a few years ago, with respect to casuals, not more than a couple of years, about 4 years ago, but a few years ago with respect to casuals, there was a view that you'd look objectively as to whether this person was really a casual. And then there was a court decision that said all that matters is the contract. Now, the problem with that was we had situations in this WorkPack case where people were being given a full-time roster for 12 months and still being defined as a casual. Now, that's just not reasonable. And I think most of the viewers would say, oh, hang on, that's not reasonable. So we're wanting to be able to have an objective test for whether or not someone's a casual, which just goes to what everybody in Australia was working with for decades before those court decisions came down. So that's what we're wanting to do. Most people who are casuals will want to stay casuals, and they'll get to stay casuals.
Okay.
This only changes for a very small portion of people. They reckon it's about 5%, and the employers agree with that, who would want to convert. They're working completely consistent hours. They can easily be converted, but some employers aren't allowing it. And, most people, students generally won't apply for this, but there'll be people who are trying to pay a mortgage or trying to keep rent, holding a household together. Try getting a mortgage or even rent a rental property these days if you don't have a secure job. It is really, really hard. And for those people, we want them to have some rights to be able to apply to convert.